Imagine a young physicist who publishes a groundbreaking paper every 8 days. Organic superconductors, single-molecule transistors. Results so spectacular the world's top journals compete to print them. Prizes pile up. Universities court him. He's spoken of as a future Nobel laureate, all before he turns 33. There was only one problem. None of it was real. His name was Jan Hendrik Schön, and for 4 years he convinced Bell Labs, the legendary institution that gave us the transistor, the laser, and 6 Nobel Prizes, that he was the most brilliant experimentalist of his generation. Some of the best scientists on Earth put their names beside his. The most prestigious journals in physics published his work dozens of times. And every safeguard science had built to catch exactly this kind of deception failed, one after another, for years. He wasn't caught by a reviewer. He wasn't caught by his famous co-authors. He was caught by a stranger who noticed that 2 completely different experiments contained the exact same noise. A fingerprint that should have been impossible to repeat. This is the story of how one quiet physicist fooled the most famous laboratory in the world, and what his deception revealed about how science actually works. Chapter 1. The Wonder Boy of Lucent. In the autumn of 1997, Bell Labs hired a young German physicist named Jan Hendrik Schön. He was 27, freshly finished with his doctorate at the University of Konstanz, and on paper he was unremarkable. His thesis work on semiconductor materials was solid but quiet. Nobody who interviewed him predicted what came next. Within 4 years, he would be the most talked-about experimental physicist on Earth, and within 5, he would be the most disgraced. To understand how one man fooled Bell Labs, you first have to understand what Bell Labs was by the time he arrived, because the institution he walked into was no longer the one that had won 6 Nobel Prizes for the transistor, the laser, and the cosmic microwave background. In 1996, AT&T had split itself apart, spinning off its equipment and research arm into a new company called Lucent Technologies. Bell Labs went with Lucent, the old model. Patient, decades-long basic research funded by a regulated telephone monopoly was already under enormous pressure. The new model demanded results that could move a stock price. This matters because the conditions that let Schön thrive were not just personal. They were structural. A laboratory hungry for headlines is a laboratory that wants to believe. Schön joined the condensed matter physics department under Bertram Batlogg, a respected and demanding Swiss physicist with a reputation for spotting important problems early. Batlogg was the senior name on most of what followed. Schön's nominal specialty was organic semiconductors, carbon-based molecules that, unlike silicon, are cheap, flexible, and easy to process, but historically far too messy and disordered to do the precise electronic work that silicon does. The dream was enormous. If you could make organic materials behave like clean crystalline semiconductors, you could build transistors, lasers, and superconductors out of plastic-like compounds. You could remake the entire electronics industry. Schön's claim was that he had found the way in. His chosen workhorse was a molecule called pentacene, and later crystals of materials like copper-based compounds and a buckyball form of carbon known as C60. His central technique was something called a field effect transistor, a device in which a voltage applied across a thin insulating layer controls the flow of current through the material beneath it. The trick, in principle, was to use this electric field to inject huge numbers of charge carriers into an otherwise pristine organic crystal, and then watch what extraordinary physics emerged. What emerged, according to Schön, was everything anyone could have wanted. The first papers were impressive, but not yet outrageous. Through 1998 and 1999, he reported high-performance organic transistors, the kind of incremental but real advance that builds a reputation. Colleagues noticed that his devices worked when others did not, that his data was unusually clean, that his yield of successful samples was remarkable. In a field where most researchers fought for months to get a single device to function, Schön seemed to produce flawless results on demand. A few people found this strange. Most found it inspiring. The natural assumption inside a place like Bell Labs was that a gifted experimentalist had simply found a better way to do the work. Then the claims began to escalate, and the escalation is the heart of the story. In late 2000 and through 2001, Schön and his co-authors published a torrent of papers, many of them in Science and Nature, the 2 most prestigious journals in the world. He reported that his crystals could be made superconducting, able to carry electricity with zero resistance, at temperatures far higher than anyone expected for such materials. He reported a fractional quantum Hall effect in organic systems, an exotic quantum phenomenon previously seen only in the most carefully grown inorganic samples. He reported organic lasers. He reported light-emitting devices. And then, in the claim that would define him, he reported a transistor built from a single organic molecule, the theoretical smallest limit of electronics, the thing the entire industry was chasing and would still be chasing decades later. At his peak, Schön was producing a research paper roughly every 8 days. In 2001 alone, his name appeared on around 24 papers. No working physicist publishes original, field-redefining experimental results at that rate. It is physically difficult to even run that many distinct experiments, let alone have every one of them succeed and overturn expectations. But the very impossibility of the pace was, perversely, read as genius. He was spoken of openly as a future Nobel laureate. He won prize after prize: the Otto Klung-Weberbank Prize, the Braunschweig Prize, the Outstanding Young Investigator Award from the Materials Research Society. Universities courted him. The Max Planck Society in Germany, the most prestigious research organization in his home country, was preparing to offer him a directorship, an extraordinary honor for a man barely into his 30s. Inside Bell Labs, the machine was working exactly as a results-driven institution wants it to work. Papers were flowing. Press was glowing. A young star was carrying the condensed matter group, and his senior collaborators were attached to a body of work that looked like it would reshape physics. The incentives all pointed one direction: keep going, publish more, ask fewer questions. What almost nobody did, for a remarkably long time, was the simplest thing. Nobody else could reproduce his results. That was not yet alarming on its own, because cutting-edge experiments often resist replication for ordinary reasons. The materials are hard, the conditions are delicate, the original group simply has more skill. So when other laboratories failed to repeat Schön's miracles, the failures were quietly blamed on the difficulty of the work rather than on the work itself. But the failures were piling up. And by early 2002, a small number of physicists outside Bell Labs had stopped looking at what Schön's data showed and started looking at the data itself, at the actual curves printed in the actual papers. What they began to notice there would, within months, bring the whole edifice down. Chapter 2. The curves that repeated. The first crack did not come from a failed experiment. It came from a photocopy. In the spring of 2002, a handful of researchers studying Schön's published papers began comparing figures across different articles. Papers describing entirely different experiments on different materials, measuring different physical effects. Lydia Sohn, then at Princeton, and Paul McEwen at Cornell, two physicists with sharp eyes and good reasons to be paying close attention, noticed something that should have been impossible. Two papers, describing two separate experiments, contain the same noise. This requires a moment of explanation, because the significance of it is easy to miss. When a physicist measures something, the current through a device, say, plotted against an applied voltage, the resulting curve is never perfectly smooth. Riding on top of the underlying signal is a faint, jagged texture called noise, tiny random fluctuations produced by the measurement itself, by thermal jitter in the electronics, by the irreducible messiness of the physical world. Noise is, in a deep sense, a fingerprint. It is generated fresh by every measurement. Two different experiments, run on different samples on different days, cannot produce identical noise any more than two people can produce identical static on two different radios. The probability is not low. It is effectively zero. And yet there it was. A curve in one Schön paper and a curve in another, supposedly recording different physics entirely, carried the same wiggles in the same places, point for point. Someone had taken one set of data and presented it twice, dressed up as two discoveries. Once the first duplication was found, people started looking harder, and the harder they looked, the worse it got. The same noise turned up in a third place. Curves that were supposed to come from different temperatures were identical. A graph labeled as one material matched a graph labeled as another. In some cases, the data appeared to have been generated by a mathematical formula rather than measured at all. Too clean, too perfect, fitting the theoretical ideal more closely than any real experiment ever does. Real data scatters around a theory. Schön's data sat directly on top of it, as if the messy intervening step of actually doing the experiment had been skipped. This is worth dwelling on, because it cuts to why the fraud lasted as long as it did. The very qualities that had made Schön a star, The flawless devices, the clean curves, the results that always came out right, were, read correctly, the signature of fabrication. The thing that looked like extraordinary skill was the absence of reality. A laboratory that had wanted to believe in a genius had been handed exactly the evidence it should have found suspicious and had interpreted it as confirmation. By April 2002, the whispers had become loud enough that they could not be contained inside the corridors of physics departments. The duplications were circulating informally among researchers, shared in emails and at conferences, with the disbelief that a company's watching a reputation begin to dissolve in real time. These were not minor papers in obscure journals. They were in Science and Nature. They had passed peer review. They had been celebrated. And now a growing number of serious people were quietly concluding that the data underneath them was not real. The pressure reached the institution itself. Bell Labs could not treat this as a difference of scientific opinion or a failure of replication that might resolve itself with better technique. Identical noise in two papers is not a disagreement. It is, on its face, evidence of misconduct. Lucent's management and the leadership of Bell Labs faced a choice that every great research institution dreads. Investigate one of your own most celebrated scientists, knowing that whatever you find will be a catastrophe. Either you harbored a fraud or you destroyed an innocent star. In May 2002, Bell Labs convened a formal investigation committee. They went outside their own walls to lead it, appointing Malcolm Beasley, a distinguished condensed matter physicist from Stanford and a former president of the American Physical Society, as chairman. The committee included other external experts, a deliberate choice meant to ensure that the inquiry could not be dismissed as a company protecting itself. Their mandate was to examine the allegations against Schön and, crucially, to determine the role of his co-authors. Because by now, Schön's name appeared on papers alongside roughly 20 other scientists, including senior figures at Bell Labs. The committee's task was harder than it might sound, and the reason exposes the second great failure beneath this story. When they went looking for the raw evidence that should settle the question, the original electronic data files, the laboratory notebooks, the physical devices themselves, they found almost nothing. Schön, it emerged, kept no proper laboratory notebooks of the kind that are the bedrock of experimental science. He had no detailed contemporaneous records of what he had done, when, and how. The raw data files had, he said, been deleted from his computer because the machine had limited storage. The samples and devices that had supposedly produced these world-changing measurements, the single-molecule transistors, the superconducting crystals, were no longer available for inspection. They were gone, damaged, discarded, or had never been kept. The most extraordinary experimental results in modern physics had left behind no physical trace that anyone could examine. For a fabricator, this absence is not an accident. It is the method. You cannot be caught faking data that no longer exists to be checked. But it also points back at the institution, because in a healthy laboratory, the keeping of records, the archiving of samples, the documentation of methods are not optional courtesies. They are the controls that make fraud difficult. Bell Labs, in its hunger for the results, had not enforced the boring disciplines that would have made those results impossible to fake. The investigation now had a fabricator with no evidence to defend himself and an institution with no evidence to exonerate itself. What the Beasley Committee did next was to reconstruct the case from the only thing that remained, the published figures themselves, and to ask each of the 20 co-authors a single, unavoidable question. What, exactly, did you see? Chapter 3. 20 names on the paper. The question the Beasley Committee put to Schön's co-authors was deceptively simple, and it opened onto one of the most uncomfortable problems in modern science. If a paper carries 20 names, and the work in it turns out to be fabricated, how many of those 20 are responsible? Who checked? Who could have checked? And what does it actually mean to put your name on a discovery you did not personally witness? By 2002, Schön's published work involved roughly 20 co-authors across dozens of papers. Most were at Bell Labs, others were collaborators at universities and research institutes who had supplied materials, theory, or specialized measurements. The most prominent name, attached to a large share of the celebrated results, was Bertram Batlogg, the senior physicist who led the department for much of the relevant period and who had been, in effect, the public face of the group's authority. When a paper claiming organic superconductivity appeared in Nature with Batlogg's name on it, the physics world did not read it as the work of an unknown 27-year-old. It read it as the work of a serious laboratory headed by a serious scientist. Batlog's reputation was part of what made the claims credible. This is the mechanism that the fraud exploited, and it is worth naming plainly because it is not unique to Schön. In modern experimental science, papers are collaborative to the point that no single author understands every part. A theorist contributes equations without ever touching a sample. A materials chemist grows a crystal and hands it off, never seeing the measurements made on it. A senior scientist supplies the ideas, the framing, the institutional weight, and trusts the junior researcher to have actually done the experiment honestly. The system runs on trust because it has to. No one can replicate every collaborator's work before signing. And that trust, which makes large-scale science possible, is precisely the thing a determined fabricator turns into a weapon. The committee had to decide where trust ended and responsibility began. Their approach was careful and, in the end, narrow. They examined each contested result and asked whether the fabrication was something a co-author should reasonably have detected, and whether any co-author had themselves manipulated data. The distinction mattered enormously to the careers hanging in the balance. Schön's defense, to the extent he offered one, was consistent and damning in its own way. He admitted that some figures were wrong. He admitted substituting data, reusing curves, presenting one measurement as another. But he insisted, again and again, that the underlying physics was real, that the effects he reported genuinely existed, that he had truly seen superconductivity and the rest, and that he had merely used representative or idealized data to illustrate findings he believed were true. It was, he claimed, a matter of sloppy presentation rather than invented science. He had cleaned things up, replaced ugly real curves with prettier ones, because he was confident the prettier version was what the experiment really showed. No one believed this, for a simple reason. If the effects were real, they would reproduce. They did not. Not in his lab once he was being watched, and not in any of the many laboratories around the world that tried. Real physics does not vanish the moment someone checks. The claim that the science was genuine but the data was merely tidied collapses the instant you ask why no honest, untidied version of it could ever be produced. The committee's central evidentiary problem remained the missing records. Without notebooks or raw files, they could not always prove what had been done. But they could compare published figures, and the comparisons were devastating. The same curves across unrelated experiments, mathematically perfect data, results that matched theory too well. The pattern was not a handful of errors. It was systematic. Whatever Schön said about his intentions, the figures themselves testified to deliberate, repeated fabrication over a span of years. In late September 2002, the Beasley Committee delivered its report. Its conclusions were stark on the central question and notably restrained on the surrounding ones. It found Jan Hendrik Schön guilty of scientific misconduct. At least 16 separate instances substantiated, involving fabrication and falsification of data across the most important papers. On the question of the co-authors, the committee reached a conclusion that satisfied almost no one and was probably the only defensible one available. It found no evidence that any co-author had participated in the fabrication. It did not assign formal misconduct to Batlog or the others, but it did not let them off cleanly either, and this is the part of the report worth sitting with. The committee raised pointed questions about the responsibilities of senior co-authors, about whether the culture of the group, the speed of publication, and the absence of basic scrutiny represented a failure of the supervision that a department head owes to the science published under his name. The finding was not innocent. It was closer to not culpable for the fraud itself, but operating in a system that should have caught it and did not. Batlog, who had supervised the work and shared in its glory, emerged legally exonerated of misconduct and yet permanently associated with the largest physics fraud of his era. He would spend years afterward addressing the question of how the senior author on so many fabricated papers could have failed to notice. There is a genuine and unresolved tension here, and it is fairer to leave it open than to pretend the report closed it. One view holds that the co-authors were victims, deceived by a colleague who exploited their trust, no more guilty than anyone defrauded by a skilled liar. Another holds that authorship is a claim of responsibility, that lending your name and reputation to a result is precisely the act of vouching for it, and that a senior scientist who vouches for 24 impossible results in a single year has failed at the one thing his seniority was for. Both positions have force. The committee, faced with the choice, chose the narrower finding and pushed the broader question back onto the scientific community, where it remains genuinely contested to this day. With the report issued, the institutional machinery moved quickly. The fabricator had been named. What remained was the reckoning. For Schön, for his degree, for the journals that had published him, and for the idea that an institution as storied as Bell Labs could be the place where this happened. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. Bell Labs fired Jan Hendrik Schön on September 25, 2002, the same day the Beasley report became public. It was the only possible outcome, and it was also, in a sense, the easiest part of the story. Dismissing a confirmed fabricator is straightforward. Undoing the damage he had done, to the scientific record, to the careers around him, to the credibility of an institution, was not. The first reckoning was with the literature itself. Schön had published roughly 100 papers in his career, and a large fraction of the most important ones were now known to be fraudulent or unreliable. Science and Nature, the journals that had competed to publish his most spectacular claims, faced the humiliating task of unpublishing them. Over the following years, journals retracted around 24 of his papers. At the time, one of the largest mass retractions in the history of physics. Retraction is the scientific equivalent of striking a verdict from the record, a formal declaration that a published result should be treated as if it had never been validated. For a single author to accumulate that many was unprecedented in the field. But retraction is a blunt and incomplete remedy, and this is where the deeper cost reveals itself. A fraudulent paper does not sit inertly waiting to be withdrawn. While it is believed, it shapes the field around it. Other physicists had read Schön's results and adjusted their own work accordingly. Some had spent months or years trying to reproduce his organic superconductors and single-molecule transistors, burning grant money and graduate student careers chasing effects that did not exist. Theorists had written papers explaining the mechanisms behind phenomena that had never occurred, constructing elegant accounts of nothing. A young researcher who had staked a thesis on extending Schön's work found the ground gone from under them through no fault of their own. The fraud's real victims were not only the co-authors whose names were tarnished, they were the strangers across the world whose honest labor had been silently wasted. The second reckoning fell on Schön's doctorate. He had earned his PhD from the University of Konstanz in Germany in 1997, before the fraudulent work at Bell Labs. His thesis itself was never shown to be fabricated. And yet in 2004, the university moved to revoke his doctoral degree. Not on the grounds that the thesis was fake, but on the grounds that his subsequent conduct had rendered him unworthy of the title under a provision of German law. This decision launched a remarkable and lengthy legal saga. Schön fought the revocation in the German courts, arguing that a degree honestly earned could not be stripped because of later misconduct unrelated to the thesis. The case wound through the legal system for years. Lower courts went back and forth. It was not until 2011, and ultimately a 2013 ruling by Germany's Federal Administrative Court, that the matter was settled. The university was entitled to revoke the degree. Schön lost. The man who had once been on the verge of a Max Planck directorship was left without even the doctorate he had legitimately held. It is worth pausing on what did not happen, because the absence is part of the story. Schön was never criminally prosecuted. Scientific fraud, however destructive, occupied a strange legal gray zone. He had not embezzled funds in a way prosecutors pursued. He had not, in the legal sense available at the time, committed a chargeable crime by fabricating physics data. The damage he caused was vast but diffuse, spread across the global scientific commons rather than concentrated on an identifiable financial victim. He paid with his career and his credentials. He did not pay with his liberty. To many scientists, this felt like an inadequate accounting, and it fed a longer argument about whether research misconduct should carry harder consequences. Schön himself largely vanished from public view. He returned to Germany. In time, he reportedly took a job in industry, in a role unrelated to the frontier research he had once seemed destined to lead. He gave few interviews. He never produced the vindicating evidence he had gestured at, never returned with real, reproducible versions of his miraculous effects, which would have been the only thing capable of rehabilitating him. The silence was its own answer. The third and most institutionally significant reckoning fell on Bell Labs. The official narrative, advanced by Lucent and accepted by the Beasley Committee's narrow finding, was that Schön was a lone bad actor, a single dishonest individual who had deceived an honest institution. There is real truth in this. The fabrication was Schön's, the lies were his, and no evidence ever emerged that anyone instructed him to cheat or knowingly helped him. But the lone wolf framing, while accurate as far as it goes, lets the institution off too lightly, and the more honest accounting is less comfortable. A lone individual can lie. It takes a system to believe him for 4 years. The structural conditions that allowed the fraud to run unchecked were not Schön's invention. The absence of required notebooks, the deletion of raw data without consequence, the discarding of devices, the willingness to publish field-redefining claims at a rate of 1 paper every 8 days without anyone inside the building demanding to see the bench and watch the experiment run. These were institutional failures. They were the predictable result of a laboratory that had come to prize publications and prestige over the slow, unglamorous controls that protect against deception. Schön supplied the dishonesty. Bell Labs, in this period of its decline, supplied the conditions that made dishonesty easy and detection slow. This is the uncomfortable hinge of the whole affair, and it is where the story stops being about one man. The Schön scandal arrived at a particular moment in the history of a particular institution. A moment of transition, financial pressure, and identity crisis, when the old certainties of what Bell Labs was for had been hollowed out and replaced by a hunger for results that could justify the laboratory's existence in a harder, more commercial world. To understand why the fraud happened where it did, you have to understand what was happening to Bell Labs itself in those years. That is the next part of the story. Chapter 5. A laboratory under pressure. To see why the Schön affair happened at Bell Labs specifically, you have to set aside the building's mythology for a moment and look at the institution as it actually was around the turn of the millennium. The Bell Labs of legend, the one that invented the transistor in 1947, the laser, the solar cell, information theory, the Unix operating system, and that won Nobel Prize after Nobel Prize, was real. But it belonged to a vanished economic world, and that world had been dismantled deliberately by court order and corporate strategy in the decades before Schön ever arrived. The original Bell Labs had been the research arm of AT&T, which for most of the 20th century operated as a government-sanctioned telephone monopoly. That monopoly is the hidden key to everything the laboratory once was. Because AT&T controlled essentially all American telephone service and earned a regulated, dependable return, it could afford to funnel enormous, stable funding into research with no immediate commercial payoff. A physicist at Bell Labs in 1955 could pursue a fundamental question about the nature of materials for years without a product in sight because the monopoly's revenue made patience affordable. Basic research was a luxury the company could sustain precisely because it did not have to fight for survival quarter by quarter. The science that made Bell Labs immortal was, in a real sense, paid for by the telephone bills of a captive nation. That arrangement ended. In 1984, after a long antitrust battle, AT&T was broken up under a consent decree. Its regional telephone operations split off into the independent Baby Bell companies. The monopoly that had underwritten decades of open-ended research was gone. Bell Labs survived the breakup attached to a slimmer AT&T, but the financial logic that had protected pure science was already eroding. Then, in 1996, came the second rupture. AT&T spun off its equipment manufacturing and research operations into a new, separately traded company, Lucent Technologies. Bell Labs became, principally, the research division of Lucent. This is the institution Schön joined in 1997. Not the serene, monopoly-funded temple of basic science, but the research arm of a young, publicly traded technology company operating in one of the most volatile markets in the world. The difference in incentives was profound. A monopoly rewards patience. A public company in a competitive market rewards visible results and rewards them on the timescale of investors, not of fundamental discovery. Lucent's stock had to perform. Its research had to demonstrate that it was generating value, ideally value that could be pointed to in a press release or an earnings call. Then the timing turned actively dangerous. The late 1990s and the year 2000 were the height of the telecommunications and internet boom, a period of euphoric expectation in exactly the sectors Lucent occupied. The company rode the bubble up, its valuation swelling on the promise of a wired and connected future. And when the bubble burst, beginning in 2000 and accelerating through 2001, Lucent was among the hardest hit. Its stock collapsed. It shed tens of thousands of jobs. It teetered, for a period, on the edge of viability. The years in which Schön's claims grew most spectacular, 2000 and 2001, were precisely the years in which his parent company was in financial free fall. Consider what that meant inside the laboratory. At the very moment, a young physicist was producing a stream of dazzling, headline-grabbing breakthroughs. Organic superconductors, single-molecule transistors, results that landed in Science and Nature and drew the world's attention to Bell Labs. The institution around him was desperate for exactly that kind of good news. A struggling company watching its stock disintegrate had every reason to celebrate a homegrown genius whose work suggested that Bell Labs still sat at the absolute frontier of physics, still deserved its legend, still mattered. Schön was not just producing science. He was producing reassurance, at a time when reassurance was scarce and precious. It would be too simple and unfair to say that Lucent's financial crisis caused the fraud. Schön fabricated data for his own reasons, and the temptation to falsify exists in rich, secure laboratories as well as struggling ones. But institutions are not neutral backdrops. They shape what gets questioned and what gets waved through. A confident, well-funded laboratory with time on its hands can afford skepticism. It can say to a young star, slow down, show us the raw data, let us watch you run the experiment before we put the institution's name behind these claims. A laboratory under existential pressure, hungry for proof of its own continued relevance, is far more inclined to accept good news at face value and far less inclined to interrogate the person delivering it. The same results that should have triggered alarm instead triggered relief. There is a further structural point that the Schön case exposed about the broader culture of science in this era beyond Bell Labs alone. The currency of a scientific career had become publication, the number of papers, the prestige of the journals, the citations accumulated. A physicist publishing a paper every 8 days in the most elite venues was, by the metrics the system actually used to allocate prestige and jobs and prizes, a spectacular success. The metrics measured output, not truth. And because the metrics rewarded volume and visibility, they created precisely the incentive a fabricator needs. Produce more, produce faster, produce results spectacular enough to clear the bar of the top journals. Schön gamed a system that was, in its design, gameable. He was an extreme case, but the vulnerability he exploited was general. None of this absolves him. The lone physicist who fooled Bell Labs was genuinely lone in his dishonesty. But the question worth asking is not only how one man could lie. It is why this particular institution, at this particular moment, was so ready to be lied to. And the answer lies in the long, slow transformation of Bell Labs from a monopoly's patient research temple into a struggling public company's source of urgently needed headlines. The fraud found fertile ground because the ground had changed. What remains is to ask what the scientific community did with the lesson, and whether the safeguards that failed so completely in Schön's case were ever actually repaired. That is where the story turns from the past toward the present. Chapter 6. What the system was supposed to catch. Science has a name for the thing that was supposed to stop Jan Hendrik Schön, and the name is peer review. Understanding why it failed, and what it was never actually designed to do, is essential to understanding how a fraud this large survived this long inside the most scrutinized venues in the field. When a scientist submits a paper to a journal like Science or Nature, it does not simply get printed. It is sent to a small number of anonymous experts in the field who read it critically and advise the editors on whether it should be published. These reviewers check whether the methods make sense, whether the conclusions follow from the data, whether the work is novel and significant, whether the authors have accounted for obvious alternative explanations. Peer review is the gatekeeping ritual of modern science, the mechanism by which the community polices what enters the permanent record. And on paper, Schön's work passed it repeatedly, at the highest level, for years. The uncomfortable truth the scandal forced into the open is that peer review was never built to detect fraud. A reviewer reads what the authors choose to present. They see the figures the authors drew, the data the authors selected, the description of the experiment the authors wrote. They do not visit the laboratory. They do not inspect the raw files. They do not watch the experiment performed or demand the original notebooks. Peer review assumes honesty and checks for competence. It asks, in effect, given that these measurements are real, do the author's claims hold up? It does not ask, are these measurements real at all? A reviewer confronting a beautifully written paper with clean, internally consistent data and plausible physics has no ordinary means of discovering that the data was invented. The fabricator and the honest researcher submit documents that look identical, because the document is all the reviewer ever sees. This is why Schön's fraud was ultimately caught not by reviewers before publication, but by readers after it. And not by readers examining his logic, but by readers examining his figures across multiple papers at once. No single reviewer of any single paper could have seen the duplicated noise, because the duplication only became visible when two separately published papers were laid side by side. The system's gatekeepers each saw one piece. The fraud lived in the relationship between the pieces, in a place no gatekeeper was positioned to look. It took outsiders, comparing finished products, to find what insiders reviewing manuscripts in isolation never could. There is a deeper irony here that the case made unavoidable. The real, robust safeguard in science is not peer review at all. It is replication, the principle that a genuine result can be reproduced by other people in other laboratories, and that an effect which only ever appears in one person's hands is no effect at all. Replication is slow, unglamorous, and chronically underfunded, because the scientific reward system, the same one that lavished prizes on Schön for volume, offers almost nothing to a researcher who painstakingly confirms or refutes someone else's claim. Reproducing another group's work does not get you into Nature. It does not win you a Max Planck directorship. And so the activity that would most reliably expose fraud is precisely the activity the system least rewards. In Schön's case, replication did eventually do its job, but only because his claims were so spectacular that many laboratories tried to build on them and failed. Had he fabricated more modest results too unimportant to attract armies of imitators, the failures to reproduce might never have accumulated into a pattern anyone noticed. He was caught partly because he was greedy. A more cautious fraud, content with smaller lies, might well have escaped. That should be a sobering thought rather than a reassuring one. The system did not catch Schön efficiently or early. It caught him slowly, late, and largely by luck, after he had already deceived the field's best journals dozens of times and spent years being celebrated as one of the most important physicists alive. The scandal prompted a wave of soul-searching and some concrete reforms. Journals tightened their policies. Many began requiring authors to retain and, on request, provide raw data. Some introduced screening of images and figures for the kind of duplication and manipulation that had exposed Schön, eventually with software tools designed to flag reused or altered visuals automatically. Institutions revisited their rules on record-keeping, on the retention of laboratory notebooks, on the documentation of methods. The very controls whose absence had made the Bell Labs case so hard to investigate. The norm that a researcher should be able to produce the original data behind a published claim, which Schön had so casually violated by deleting his files, was reasserted with new seriousness. But it would be dishonest to present this as a problem solved. The structural vulnerabilities the case revealed have proven stubborn. The publication metrics that reward volume over verification are still, broadly, the metrics that govern scientific careers. Replication remains underfunded and undervalued. Peer review still cannot, by its nature, detect a careful liar. And in the years since Schön, science has lived through a broader replication crisis, particularly in fields like psychology and biomedicine, in which large numbers have published findings, most of them not fraudulent, merely fragile or wrong, have failed to reproduce. Schön was an acute, deliberate version of a chronic, systemic problem. A scientific literature that contains more error than its prestige suggests, protected by safeguards that are weaker than the public, and often the scientists themselves, assume. It is worth holding two things in mind at once, because the fair conclusion is genuinely double-edged. On one hand, science did eventually self-correct. The fraud was exposed, the papers retracted, the perpetrator removed, the lesson absorbed. The mechanism is real, and it worked. On the other hand, it worked far too slowly, depended too much on the vigilance of a few unrewarded individuals, and corrected only the most flagrant case while leaving the underlying incentives largely intact. Whether you read the Schön affair as a story of science's resilience or of its fragility depends on which half you emphasize, and honest observers have emphasized both. What the case did not leave in doubt was the human dimension. The specific question of how a single person could carry a deception of this scale for this long, And what, if anything, it tells us about the others who failed to stop him. That is the part the official reports could never fully resolve, and it is where the story becomes hardest to settle. Chapter 7. The Unanswered Questions. The Beasley report established what Schön did. It could not establish why, and it could not fully resolve who else, if anyone, should have stopped him. Those questions outlived the investigation, and they are worth confronting directly rather than smoothing over, because the easy answers are mostly wrong. Start with the man himself. The most natural assumption about a fraud of this magnitude is that it was driven by some grand design, a calculated scheme to win a Nobel Prize, a cold ambition that justified any means. But the picture that emerged from those who worked alongside Schön is stranger and, in a way, more disturbing than simple villainy. He was not, by most accounts, an obvious schemer. He was described as quiet, pleasant, unassuming, even shy. He did not behave like a man who believed he was perpetrating the largest physics fraud in living memory. He behaved like a productive colleague. This is part of what made him so effective. A loud, arrogant figure invites scrutiny. A modest, agreeable one who simply keeps producing good results invites trust. Schön's own explanation, to the extent he ever gave one, was that he believed the effects were real. He maintained that he had genuinely observed the phenomena he reported, and that his fabrications were a matter of presenting idealized or representative data for results he was confident actually existed. Read most charitably, this describes a man who came to believe his own intuition so completely that the actual experimental data became, to him, a formality. Something to be tidied, improved, or substituted when the real measurements were inconvenient or absent, because he already knew what the answer was supposed to be. If that account is even partly true, it points to a psychology more troubling than calculated deceit, a slow erosion of the boundary between what one has measured and what one wishes were so, until the distinction stops feeling important. Most observers reject Schön's framing as self-serving, and it almost certainly is. But it raises a real question about how fraud begins, which is rarely with a single decision to lie, and more often with a series of small accommodations that compound past the point of return. There is no way to verify what Schön actually believed, and it would be irresponsible to pretend otherwise. He is the only one who knows, and his statements are exactly the statements a guilty man would make. The honest position is that his motives remain genuinely opaque. The certainty people crave about the inner life of a fraud, that he was simply evil, or simply deluded, or simply ambitious, is not available here. What is available is the behavior, and the behavior was systematic, sustained, and incompatible with honest science. The harder unanswered question concerns everyone around him. The Beasley Committee cleared the co-authors of misconduct, and as discussed, that finding was probably correct on the narrow legal and evidentiary question. But it left a broader question hanging that no committee could answer. How did so many capable scientists, including some of the best in the world, fail to notice for so long? Several answers have been offered, and the fair thing is to acknowledge that they are partial and that they compete. One answer is division of labor. In modern collaborative science, the co-authors each saw only their piece, and no single person was positioned to see the whole. The theorist trusted the experimentalist, the materials supplier trusted the device maker, the senior author trusted the brilliant junior researcher. This is a real structural feature, not an excuse invented after the fact. A second answer is the seduction of the results themselves. Schön's findings were not just plausible, they were thrilling, the kind of work people wanted to be associated with. Desire is a powerful suppressant of doubt. When a result confirms what you hoped was possible and elevates everyone attached to it, the incentive to scrutinize it weakens at exactly the moment scrutiny matters most. A third answer is the simplest and least flattering, that ordinary diligence lapsed. That a senior co-author signing a paper a week on results too good to be true, produced at a humanly impossible rate, should have asked to see the bench, and did not. These explanations are not mutually exclusive, and the most honest synthesis is that all three operated together. The system's design made the fraud hard to see. The appeal of the results made people not want to see it, and the basic vigilance that might have overcome both was not exercised. Assigning a single cause flatters our desire for a tidy story. The reality was a convergence of structural blindness, motivated credulity, and individual lapse, no one of which would have been sufficient alone. It is also worth resisting the temptation to make the co-authors into villains as a way of resolving our discomfort. There is a real injustice in their position, and it deserves acknowledgement. Most of them were, in a meaningful sense, victims. Scientists whose trust was exploited and whose reputations were damaged by a colleague's deception they did not share in and did not benefit from once it collapsed. Batlogg, in particular, carried a permanent professional shadow despite never being found to have fabricated anything. Whether that outcome is fair depends on what you believe authorship obligates. If putting your name on a paper is a guarantee of its truth, then the shadow is earned. If it is a more limited claim, that you contributed honestly to a collaborative effort and trusted your collaborators to do the same, then the shadow is partly unjust. Reasonable people, including reasonable scientists, genuinely disagree about this, and the disagreement is not a sign that the question is trivial. It is a sign that science had not, before Schön, been forced to decide what authorship actually means, and arguably still has not. The final unanswered question is the largest and the least comfortable. How many other Schöns are there? The honest answer is that nobody knows. The case is famous precisely because it was caught, and it was caught because it was extreme. The fabrications that are more modest, more careful, more patient. The ones that do not invite 100 laboratories to try and fail to reproduce them, leave no obvious trace, and may sit undetected in the literature indefinitely. The Schön affair is reassuring in that it was exposed and alarming in what its exposure implies about everything that is never tested so severely. Both readings are correct. Which one keeps you up at night is a matter of temperament. That leaves the last task, to take the measure of what this episode actually means for Bell Labs, for physics, and for the fragile machinery of trust that all of science runs on. Chapter 8. What the Scandal Left Behind. Jan Hendrik Schön disappeared from physics, but the questions he raised did not, and the most useful way to close this story is to ask what it actually changed and what it merely exposed. The two are not the same, and conflating them produces a more comforting account than the facts support. Begin with Bell Labs. The scandal landed on an institution already in decline, and it is tempting to treat it as a symbol of that decline. The moment the temple of 20th century science was revealed to have rot at its core. That reading is too neat. Bell Labs did not fall because of Schön. It had been falling, slowly and for structural reasons, since the breakup of the AT&T monopoly that once funded its patients. Schön was a symptom of the new environment, not the cause of the institution's troubles. But he was a particularly cruel symptom, because he struck at the one thing the laboratory still indisputably possessed, its reputation. A struggling company can lose money and recover. A research institution that loses its credibility loses the only currency that ever truly mattered. For a place whose entire identity rested on having been right about the transistor, the laser, and the structure of the universe, to become known also as the place that produced the largest physics fraud of its generation was a wound of a different kind. Bell Labs continued, changed hands again when Lucent merged into Alcatel-Lucent and later passed to Nokia, and survived in diminished form. But the Schön affair remains a permanent entry in its story, a dark counterweight to the Nobel Prizes. For physics as a discipline, the lasting effect was a loss of innocence about its own safeguards. Before Schön, the comfortable assumption inside the field was that fraud at the highest level was nearly impossible, that the combination of peer review, replication, and the sheer scrutiny applied to elite results would catch any serious deception quickly. The case demonstrated that this confidence was misplaced. The best journals in the world had published fabricated physics dozens of times. The safeguards had not failed at the margins. They had failed at the center, on the most celebrated work, for years. That recognition was painful but valuable. A discipline that understands its defenses are weaker than it assumed is better positioned than one that believes itself invulnerable. Whether physics fully absorbed the lesson is debatable, but it at least could no longer pretend the vulnerability did not exist. The concrete reforms that followed were real but modest, and honesty requires holding both adjectives together. Journals strengthened data retention requirements and began screening figures for manipulation. Institutions revisited record-keeping standards. The expectation that a scientist must be able to produce the raw data behind a claim was reasserted. These were genuine improvements, and some of them would make a Schön-style fraud harder to execute today, particularly the automated detection of duplicated images that first exposed him. but the reforms addressed the mechanics of his specific method more than the conditions that produced it. The incentive structure that rewards publication volume over verification survived. The chronic underfunding of replication survived. The fundamental fact that peer review checks competence and assumes honesty survived, because there is no obvious way to build a review system that does otherwise without grinding science to a halt. The deepest vulnerabilities were named, not removed. This is the genuinely difficult conclusion the case leaves us with, and it resists the tidy moral that this kind of story usually wants to deliver. The instinct is to end on resolution. The fraud was caught, the system corrected itself, the safeguards held in the end. And there is truth in that. Schön was exposed, removed, stripped of his degree, and erased from the field. The machinery of self-correction did eventually function, but it functioned slowly, late, and through the unrewarded vigilance of a few individuals who happened to look closely at the right figures against a fraud extreme enough to demand attention. To call that a triumph of scientific integrity is to mistake survival for health. The honest verdict is that science caught Schön despite its incentives, not because of them, and that a more disciplined liar might have escaped the same net entirely. There is a further reflection worth making, because it reaches beyond science into something more general. The Schön affair is fundamentally a story about trust, and about what happens when trust is necessary but unverifiable. Large-scale science cannot function without it. No physicist can personally rederive every result they build upon. No co-author can replicate every collaborator's contribution. No reviewer can rerun every experiment they assess. The entire enterprise rests on the assumption that people are, by and large, telling the truth about what they observed. That assumption is not naive. It is structurally required. The cost of abandoning it, of treating every colleague as a suspect, every result as a probable lie, would be a science too paralyzed by suspicion to function. And yet the very necessity of that trust is what makes it exploitable. Schön did not break into a vault. He walked through a door that has to be left open for science to work at all. This is the permanent tension the case exposes. The openness that makes discovery possible is the same openness that makes deception possible, and there is no setting of the dial that eliminates one without crippling the other. What, finally, remains? Not the discoveries. Schön's organic superconductors and single-molecule transistors never existed. The papers are retracted, the effects were never real, and the field built nothing lasting on them. In that sense, he produced nothing at all, which is its own strange epitaph for a man who was briefly the most published physicist alive. What remains is the lesson, and the lesson is uncomfortable rather than inspiring. It is that prestige is not proof, that a great institution's name on a claim is not the same as the claim being true, that the rate at which results arrive is not a measure of their reality, and that data too clean to question is, often, exactly the data that should be questioned most. The scientists who finally caught Schön did so by ignoring everything impressive about him, the journals, the prizes, the pedigree, the institution, and looking only at the curves on the page, which did not lie even when everything around them did. A laboratory that wanted to believe was given exactly what it wanted to believe, and for 4 years it asked too few questions. That, more than any retracted paper, is what the Bell Labs scandal left behind. A reminder that the hardest thing for any institution to scrutinize is the good news it most wants to be true.